Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn the absolute basics of programming. So how the computer executes code, how code is case sensitive, matching parentheses, and a bunch more. Okay, so in the Getting Started lecture we built this default console app project. Here we have a bunch of code. Again, I will explain all of this in detail in a little bit. This one over here is a comment, and here we've got something running a function in order to print some text onto the console. We can run this code, so again we can go up here or press F5, and yep, it runs the console, and right away it does say our message. Now the first thing to learn is how the code actually runs, and that is how the code runs from top to bottom. Meaning if we have 4 instructions, it is going to first run this line of code, then it's going to run this line of code, then this one, and finally this one. It is always going to execute one after the other, always from top to bottom. Now later on when we learn more about functions, we will see how the code execution jumps a little bit, but in the end it's really all just sequentially running from one to the other from top to bottom. So up here, if I copy this line and I run this function twice, and on the second time I say something else, again, code runs from top to bottom, so it is going to first execute this one and print this line onto the console, and then it's going to execute this one. And if it is exactly like that. Also, one very important thing is in C#, the end of an instruction is denoted by a semicolon. If we do not have it, if I erase this, then the code basically assumes that the instruction is not over. Another thing is how new lines don't really matter to the compiler. So I can add a bunch of new lines and then a semicolon, and now this is perfectly valid code. All same thing when accessing a function. So over here I can add a ton of new lines. Right after the dot I can add a ton of new lines. Now you can't add it in the middle of something, like in the middle of this function name. If I split it, then it does cause an error. But otherwise, new lines generally do not matter. In terms of running the code, all that really matters is the semicolon. That is what actually defines the end of an instruction. A lot of beginners make the mistake of forgetting about that. They usually forget about the semicolon and they get a whole bunch of errors. Which, by the way, if you see a red squiggly line and you just put the mouse over it, it won't tell you the error. In this case, the error is simple, and our helper function actually helps us see what the error is. So in here, there's just an expected semicolon. If we add it, everything's fine. So if you find any strange issues, always make sure to remember that you need a semicolon in order to end an instruction. And also, speaking of things that don't matter, so new lines generally don't matter. Another thing that does not matter is indentation. So right now I can indent this line just like this, and it's going to run, and I can have another one indented a bunch more. So I can have code written like this, and if I run it, yep, everything still runs exactly the same. If you've done some Python programming, then in that language indentation does matter, but over here in C# it does not. This is perfectly valid code. Although of course bad indentation like this one can make the code hard to read, so even though technically it does not matter for the compiler, it definitely matters to you in order to make the code easy to read, so always make sure you indent your code properly. Another extremely important thing is how code is case sensitive, meaning for example over here we've got an instruction, a console.writeLine. If I instead write line with a lowercase l, nope, there is an error. There is no such thing called writeLine with a lowercase l. There only exists one with an uppercase L. So you need to always pay very close attention to how you write your code. This is one of the main things that I see a lot of beginners make their mistake. They write code like this and they don't know why it's not working. They assume that as long as the words are correct, so for example if I write it like this, they assume since this is technically the same thing as over here, in terms of English, they both say the same thing. They assume that because of that it should work, but in reality no, this does not work, and the answer is always because they did not write the code exactly as it needs to be. It needs to be 100% exact, including capitalization. So it cannot be in lowercase c, it has to be in uppercase C, only that actually matches the console. And writeLine cannot be written like this, the W needs to be uppercase and the L also needs to be uppercase. So if you have issues in your code, the first thing you should check is see if you are writing the capitalization correctly. It is not just the words that matter, it's everything. It's the capitalization, it's the place where you put the dot, the place where you open and close parentheses, the semicolon, all of that. All of that matters, so always make sure you write your code very carefully because every single detail matters. And of course, you can always rely on code autocompletion to help you write. Usually after writing a dot, you see the autocompletion, and if you start writing writeLine, over here it shows you exactly as it should be. You can just press enter and everything will be written properly. Now, the next important thing is knowing where to write the code. Now, over here in the new template, over here it's easy. You can just write code and all of this will execute without problems. But now here on the previous standard template, on this one, note there's a bunch of curly braces. These curly braces form what is known as a code block. Code is grouped between blocks. For example, everything inside of this code block, everything here belongs to this namespace, then everything inside this code block belongs to this class, and everything inside this code block belongs to this function. Again, don't worry what is a namespace, class, or function right now. I will cover all of those in detail later on. For now, all I want you to learn is what is a code block, which is everything inside a curly braces, and that impacts what kind of code you can write within each code block. So for example, in this old template, in this one here we need to write the code inside the main function. This is where the program actually starts executing. Like I said, the code executes from top to bottom, and as soon as we run this program, it is going to start right here from inside the main function. It starts running from this first line. If we run just like this, if there you go, it still works, has exactly the same thing. However, if I take this code and I remove it from the function, and let's say I paste it just over here, so just inside the class code block, if I do, then obviously I get a whole bunch of errors. This is because we are writing code inside a class block, and inside a class block you cannot execute a normal instruction, you can only define fields, functions, and so on. Now in this case the error isn't very helpful, so really just remember where you are writing your code. If you're writing a regular instruction that you want to execute, then chances are you want to write it inside a function. In this case, chances are you want to write it inside the main function. So always keep this in mind. Like I said, it's very important how you actually write your code, but it's also extremely important where you write it. If you're writing code inside of this own template, then make sure to not write the code out here or directly inside namespace or directly inside the class. If you're writing some kind of regular instruction, make sure you write it inside main. Although in the beginning portion of this course, we're really just going to be writing our code in the simpler, newer template just to avoid any confusion. Over here, we have no curly braces, so there's no issues like that. We can just write all of our instructions over here sequentially and everything will execute once again, top to bottom. And finally, very important is to always make sure you have matching opening and closing symbols. That refers to, for example, code blocks. Every opening curly brace needs to have an ending one, and same thing over here for parentheses. Every time there's one beginning, there has to be a matching ending one. If I go ahead and I erase one of these, like for example over here, opening namespace, we've got 1, then inside the class we've got 2, and inside the main we've got 3, and over here we have 3 closing ones. But if I get rid of one of these, if there you go, now we have an error, and this one is a nice helpful error, so it tells us that one more is expected. So always double check that you have the exact same number of both opening and closing braces and parentheses. Over here, same thing. If I erase one of these parentheses, yep, that's also an error because we did not finish the parentheses that are calling the function. So always make sure the same number of matching opening and closing. If you put the cursor inside of it, it should highlight the opening and the closing braces. So if I put the cursor here, it highlights both those. If I put it here, it highlights both those, and so on. And in general, whenever you make some sort of error, like let's say you forgot to write that, you forgot to terminate the instruction, you see the red squiggly line. So always remember you can place your mouse over it and it gives you a bit more information. Sometimes the error is super helpful like this one, but sometimes it might be a little bit more confusing. So also remember you can refer back to the common errors lecture to see some common issues. Or of course, remember you can always post questions in the comments and I'll do my best to help. Okay, so here we'll learn how code executes from top to bottom. We'll learn how it's extremely important that code is case sensitive and you should always double check that you wrote the code exactly as it should be. And we learned what is a code block and where we should write code, as well as the importance on making sure we always have a matching number of opening and closing symbols. Now with this basic knowledge, we are now ready to learn one of the basic building blocks of programming, which are variables. So let's learn that in the next lecture.